guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to cover again trans fatty acids. It's something that I've talked about before. It's something that I've written about on my blog. But I want to discuss something in particular that I haven't really covered before, and it's to be honest, it's not that often an aspect of trans fats that's looked at, and that's a comparison between the naturally occurring trans fats that we get in our diet and those that are from a synthetic source. Now, there was a study that was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition a year ago, and I've been reading that study and I found it quite interesting. So I'll put the link to that study in the comments box below this video so that you can refer to the paper that I'm discussing. And I just wanted to really have a bit of a talk about the difference between natural and synthetic trans fats and the effects they have on our health. Now, where do we get our natural trans fats from? Well, actually, maybe before I cover that, maybe I should cover what trans fats actually are, because some people may not actually be aware of what a trans fatty acid is. A trans fat is really an unsaturated fat that has a slightly different configuration to the normal cis configuration we find in unsaturated fats. Now, normally on a fatty acid, when you introduce a double bond, which is what we have in unsaturated fats, when you introduce a double bond, the hydrogens tend to be on the same side of the molecule at the double bond, and this has the hydrogens repel one another, and this causes the molecule to bend. So unsaturated fatty acids are not straight molecules like saturated fats. They have kinks in them. And this is the normal cis configuration. That's what it's called. When the hydrogens are on the same side of the molecule, it's called a cis fatty acid. Now, most of the unsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats in our diets have this cis configuration, and therefore they're highly kinked molecules. And that's useful in our physiology for a number of reasons. But most importantly, these fatty acids are incorporated into cell membranes, and because they're kinked, they take up more space within the membrane, and that increases the fluidity of the membrane. If our membranes have a lot of straight molecules in them, in our cell membranes, this increases the rigidity of the membrane. So by increasing the amount of these cis fatty acids in our cell membranes, the cells can actually increase the fluidity of their membranes, and that changes the permeability of the membranes and has all sorts of effects on cell function. It's a normal physiological thing for our cells to do, and they also use cholesterol to increase the rigidity of the membranes. And by increasing the ratio of cholesterol to these unsaturated cis fatty acids, they can actually there can be some significant changes in cell function. Two of the important cis fatty acids in our diet are alpha-linolenic acid and linoleic acid, and they're the essential fatty acids. They're also incorporated into cell membranes, and they then can be taken out of the cell membranes into the cells, where they're converted into a series of hormone-like chemicals called eicosanoids. And those eicosanoids regulate cell function, and one of the pathways in particular that they're very important in regulating is the inflammatory pathway. And I've covered the essential fats before, but I just wanted to show they are cis fatty acids. They're normal polyunsaturated fatty acids, and these normal unsaturated fats that we have in our diet are generally in the cis configuration. Now, there are a much smaller amount of fats that we have in our diet. They're in what's called the trans configuration. If we take a normal cis unsaturated fat and we move the hydrogens, so that instead of the hydrogens being on the same side of the molecule at the double bond, we move one to the other side of the molecule, the repelling force that the hydrogens have disappears, and this therefore straightens the molecule. So a trans unsaturated fat has the same straight structure as a saturated fat, and this has important implications, because these fatty acids are really recognized in the same way as the normal native cis fatty acids, but they're actually slightly different, and therefore they can, it's suspected they can interfere with, for example, icosanoid synthesis and the metabolism of the normal cis fatty acids by simply getting in the way in the pathways. So these trans fatty acids may have detrimental effects, and this is an area of ongoing research. But there are two sources that we can get these trans fatty acids in our diet. The first source is a natural source, and the natural source of trans fats that we have in our diet is from ruminant products. So that would be mainly milk and things that are made from milk. Now, the reason that ruminants produce trans fats is because they produce a fatty acid that is called conjugated linoleic acid, and this is produced naturally in ruminants, and when we drink the milk we consume this conjugated linoleic acid. Now, conjugated linoleic acid is interesting because it has a double bond that is in the trans configuration and another double bond that's actually in the cis configuration. So it's got a kink in it, but the second double bond is actually straightened out. Now, in the metabolism, in the metabolic pathway that forms this conjugated linoleic acid, there are intermediate products, and in order to be able to produce the cis and the trans configuration, one of the intermediate products is actually a trans fatty acid. So before the second cis double bond is incorporated into the molecule, one of the intermediate products is actually a trans fatty acid called vicenic acid, and this vicenic acid is actually present in milk, and when we drink the milk we not only get the conjugated linoleic acid, which is the end product of this metabolic pathway, we also get this intermediate product which is a trans fatty acid called vicenic acid. Now that's our main source of trans fatty acids in the diet from a natural source, and those people that drink milk, about 5% of the fatty acids in milk and milk products will be this trans fatty acid, and in total, if you're a milk drinker and you consume large amounts of milk and dairy products, you'll maybe have probably somewhere between 1 and 2% of your total fat energy will come from these trans fats. So quite a small amount, but it's measurable, and it's still a significant dietary component. The synthetic forms of trans fats are slightly different. They're formed mainly from vegetable oils. Now, vegetable oils contain polyunsaturated fats and also monounsaturated fats. Now, when vegetable oils are converted into, for example, vegetable spreads, you can see that there is a change in the structure of the fatty acids, because vegetable oils at room temperature are liquid and vegetable spreads are solid. So in order to be able to create a vegetable oil spread, you have to change the configuration of the fatty acids in the vegetable oil. And to do that, manufacturers have understood that you can create saturated fats from the original unsaturated fats, and this is a process called hydrogenation. What happens is there's a chemical reaction occurs, hydrogen gas is used, and the hydrogen is actually kind of reacts with the molecule, the original unsaturated fat, and this actually causes the formation of saturated fats, which are solid at room temperature, and that's effectively what a vegetable spread is. It's a conversion of the original polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats in the vegetable oil into something that contains no double bonds, and therefore is more of a saturated fat. Now, those saturated fats in themselves will have the same effects as normal saturated fats. They are effectively chemically converted into saturated fats, and will have the biochemical properties of saturated fats. But in that process, some of the molecules, some of the poly and monounsaturated vegetable oils, only get partially hydrogenated, and in this intermediate form they form a trans fat. So there is a very high proportion of trans fats in vegetable oils that have been converted into these spreads. And about 40% of the fatty acids in these vegetable oils are trans fats, and a number of them have been researched. Alaidic acid is one of the ones that has been identified as possibly being detrimental to the health, but there are others and they do seem to have slightly different effects. So because that's a bit of a background filler, so because we have these natural sources and synthetic sources of trans fats, researchers have been interested to see what's the difference between the biochemical effects when we have them in our diet. And I came across this paper that I've been reading that's quite interesting, and it was a comparison between some natural trans fats and some synthetic trans fats. And what the researchers did is they took a group of healthy people, and for 24 days they fed them a diet containing different types of trans fats. The diet was controlled so that the only thing that was different were the amounts of trans fats, and the extra calories that the trans fats provided they were compensated for by removing some of the saturated fat from the diet. Now, anyone that's ever looked at looked into this or watched perhaps some of my videos will know that as soon as you take one thing out of a diet and start adding something else, it's very difficult to make firm conclusions about what's actually having the effect, because you're effectively manipulating more than one variable. So bear that in mind when you read the paper, but it is interesting nonetheless, and therefore I'll just quickly discuss it. So what were the different treatments that they used in this study? They had a control diet that had no more energy than 0.1% of total energy from trans fats. That was the control diet, and I think that level was picked because they realised that it would be not possible to completely remove trans fats from the diet. So this 0.1% intake was representative of a very baseline of intake of trans fats. Then on top of this, they had another diet that contained 3.3% of total energy as natural trans fats. So that was actually as vachenic acid, and they had a very similar diet that was also 3.3% of energy, and that was from synthetic trans fats. That was a mixture of synthetic trans fats, and that may have contained aladic acid, but it also certainly had other trans fats within the diet as well. And then lastly, they had another treatment that contained 0.9% of total energy as one of the isomers of conjugated linoleic acid. So those were the treatments. Now, what did they find in the results? Well, what they found was that compared with the control diet, both the vachenic acid and the synthetic trans fat diets both increased low density lipoprotein cholesterol levels in the blood, and they both increased total cholesterol levels, although they did go higher in the vachenic acid group. So the natural trans fats actually caused a greater increase in low density lipoprotein cholesterol and total cholesterol compared with the synthetic trans fat diet. What they also found is that there was also an increase in triglyceride levels and also in lipoprotein A in the vachenic acid group, in the natural trans fat group. So as a whole, the natural trans fats appeared to have more detrimental changes in terms of lipoproteins compared with the synthetic trans fats. And that was obviously an interesting finding within the study. However, the vachenic acid group, the natural trans fat group, also had an increase in their high density lipoprotein cholesterol levels. Now, increases in low density lipoprotein, total cholesterol and lipoprotein A, while they're seen as detrimental, increases in high density lipoprotein are actually beneficial. So while there was detrimental effects from consuming both the synthetic and natural trans fat diets, there were also some beneficial effects from the natural trans fat diet. There was no increase in high density lipoprotein cholesterol in the synthetic trans fat group. So there are some subtle differences there between vachenic acid, the natural trans fat we find in ruminant products, and the synthetic fats that we get from vegetable oil. They clearly have different effects, and because the synthetic trans fat diet was a mixture of trans fats. It's not possible to say which of the trans fats, which of the synthetic trans fats was the cause of these effects. So that's quite interesting. What happened with the conjugated linoleic acid diet? Well, those people who were consuming 0.9% of their calories as conjugated linoleic acid actually had a decrease in their plasma triglyceride levels. The rest of their lipoprotein levels stayed the same, and so the only change that they saw compared with the controlled diet was a reduction in these in triglyceride levels, which, remember, triglycerides is also called very low density lipoprotein cholesterol. So overall, there were some subtle differences, and taking the data as a whole, I think you could sum it up by saying that conjugated linoleic acid has beneficial effects, whereas both natural and synthetic trans fats may have some detrimental effects, but those effects differ slightly, and the detrimental effects from the natural trans fats may be offset somewhat by some beneficial effects. So this is a very complicated area, and I think really that there is a requirement for a lot more research to determine exactly which of these compounds has which effects. The conclusion, I think, from the authors in the paper were that both natural and synthetic trans fats do have detrimental effects on plasma cholesterol levels, and therefore they may have a detrimental effect on the risk of increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. There was a nurses' health study that looked at the effects of trans fats in the diets of nurses, and it was only looking at female nurses, and it showed that for every 2% increase in trans fats in the diet, there was a doubling of the risk of cardiovascular disease. So that's often cited as information as to the detrimental effects of trans fats. So clearly in this study, natural trans fats did have some detrimental effects. Just quickly covering the conjugated linoleic acid aspect, the reduction in triglycerides fits with the other data that's been published previously on conjugated linoleic acid, which shows that it has insulin sensitizing effects and may cause weight loss. One of the effects that you would expect after you'd caused weight loss and an insulin sensitizing effect in the subjects would actually be a reduction in triglycerides. So the reduction in triglycerides may well have come in addition to other changes that weren't measured, but whatever these results are consistent with what's been shown about conjugated linoleic acid in the past. If we go back to the comparing the natural and the synthetic trans fats, I think it's interesting that there's a number of points that really need to be mentioned in terms of this study. Firstly, we don't know what synthetic trans fats were incorporated in this mixture. It was a mixture of trans fats, and really up to now the synthetic trans fat that's been shown to have detrimental effects is aladic acid. Because the trans fats were a mixture, the negative effects of the trans fatty acids may actually been watered down somewhat. Not necessarily, but I think it's worth mentioning that is a possible area where the methodology is quite weak. What they really should have compared is vachenic acid with aladic acid. That would have been, I think, a better comparison, and then you would have been able to isolate the actual effects of a single compound rather than a number of compounds. Mixing compounds together like that just means that you have to perform another research experiment then to see which of the compounds is actually having the detrimental effect. The other thing that's worth noting is that there was quite a high amount of trans fats used in this study. Normally, about 5% of the fat of all of the fats in ruminant, say milk, is vachenic acid, and total intakes of vachenic acid are probably around. Well, they're certainly less than 2% of total energy. Yet 3.3% of total energy was used in this study, which is about twice. It's not twice, but it could be in some people getting on for twice the amount of vachenic acid that they would normally consume. So therefore, we have to take the results with a pinch of salt in terms of relating them to a normal diet. It may well be that vegetonic acid at very high concentrations does have detrimental effects, and you would expect that from the biochemistry of knowing about trans fats. They interfere with essential fatty acids, they interfere with metabolic pathways, and there's no reason to suspect that natural trans fats would have different effects to synthetic ones. The real difference between trans fats from a natural source and trans fats from a synthetic source that most people miss is that the trans fats from natural sources are in the diet at much lower concentrations than synthetic trans fats. If you eat a typical Western diet, if you eat a lot of vegetable products with vegetable spreads and vegetable oils in them, the level of trans fats that you'll have in your diet will be much higher than you would be normally be getting from the trans fats that come from natural sources. So the 3.3% of trans fats in the diet may actually be low for somebody consuming a Western diet containing lots of vegetable oil, for example. So that's also worth mentioning, is that the levels in this are difficult to extrapolate into a person eating a normal diet or a Western diet or a traditional diet, because the levels are different. But the biochemical effects are interesting, but I don't think they show anything that you wouldn't be able to predict. I would certainly expect that at high levels both natural and synthetic trans fats may have similar biochemical effects, because they're structurally very similar molecules. So that's worth mentioning as well. I've already mentioned about the fact that they removed saturated fat from the diet, and that obviously means that you can't actually state what is having the effect, because it could be the reduction in saturated fat, or it could be the increase in trans fats. So again, there's an area of problem within the methodology there. But what I really want to do to finish off is just to summarise. The biochemical effects are very interesting, but they don't prove that you're going to get a disease. They just show that you have an increased risk of that disease. What I wanted to do is just highlight something that's more general about milk and consuming dairy products. There's been an ongoing controversy about consuming trans fats for a long time, and generally I think they are known to be detrimental in the diet, particularly this oleic acid, which has been quite extensively researched. It does have these detrimental effects. But in terms of the natural versus synthetic argument, this has been raging for a long time, and people haven't come to any real conclusion. But if you stand back from the nuances of the biochemical changes, and you actually look at milk and people who consume milk, they actually tend to be healthier than those people who don't. There's a lot of epidemiological evidence, and there's also clinical trial evidence that shows that those people that consume dairy products, those people who consume milk, cheese, yogurt in particular, actually have lower body weights than those people who don't consume those products. Milk does seem to have this beneficial effect, and therefore what I would say is that milk is often given the role of the villain in nutrition, and certainly some people are allergic to milk. Certainly some people have an intolerance to lactose, for example, but for the vast majority of people that are able to digest lactose, milk appears to be, as long as it's moderated, milk appears to be a healthy food, and those people that consume it as part of a healthy, high quality diet appear to actually have lower body weights than those people who don't consume it. So what I would say is that even if the trans fats in milk are detrimental, and they do have detrimental biochemical changes, overall as a food the products of ruminants are actually healthy products. So those biochemical effects are obviously overcome by other factors within the milk that actually have beneficial effects. And this is the problem with when you break nutrition down to individual biochemical effects. When you look at when you start to think of nutrients as drugs, and you start to test single isolated compounds on single isolated biochemical factors, you lose this big picture. And this big picture is what nutrition is all about. Really what I would suggest is that even if vegetonic acid in milk had detrimental biochemical effects, clearly milk as a whole is not a food that is bad for your health. In those people that can drink it, it appears to be beneficial to the health. So therefore, taking dairy products as a whole, I would suggest that is the way to look at this trans fat argument. rather than looking at the individual biochemical effects of these chemicals, which they are interesting, and you should look at them and study them, but you should take them in context, rather than taking that as gospel, rather than taking that as all you need to know. I think you need to step back and actually look at the whole picture. And looking at the whole picture shows us that dairy products are healthy foods, and as long as they're moderated and they're not over consumed, and as long as the trans fats within the diet seem to remain below a particular level from natural sources, they don't seem to have detrimental effects. My personal opinion, for what it's worth, is that as long as you eat a high quality diet, if you're consuming some trans fats from natural sources, I don't think that is a problem, as long as your diet is of high quality. I think it would be unwise of me to say that avoiding milk is a good policy or is going to improve your health, because certainly some people do seem to be fine with dairy products and do seem to be fine with milk. But what I would say is that from what I've read and what I've researched on synthetic trans fats, particularly this alaidic acid, I don't think there is a place for that in the diet in any amount. If you want some very expert advice and some very expert opinion on alaidic acid and trans fats, there is a researcher called Mary Enig, and she is possibly, I'm not going to say she's the world's expert on trans fats, but she's certainly one of the world's experts on trans fats. And if you want to know more about trans fats, I would strongly suggest that you read some of the material that she has put out on trans fats and fatty acids in general. She did write a very good book on fatty acids, which is highly recommended. And I think that was called Know Your Fats. And her opinion is that these trans fats from synthetic sources are the ones that should be avoided, and I think I tend to agree with that opinion. So I hope that was interesting. Sometimes in nutrition it's better to step back and look at the broad picture than it is to look at these individual biochemical changes, which people seem to get drawn into and discuss endlessly, when really I think you can generalize and say that milk, really, if it's moderated, dairy products, if they're moderated and you're not allergic to them, you don't have an intolerance, they actually seem to have beneficial effects. So I will put the link to that paper in the comments box below this video. Please feel free to have a look at that and read it after you've watched this video if you want some more details. Remember to eat well, stay healthy and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video. Take care.